This is Viewpoint, Brett Godfrey podcast, episode number 8, I believe. And we're here today with a great guest I'll introduce in a minute. But I'd like to just remind the folks that watch or listen to this podcast we are here to share different viewpoints, different than the ones you may have, different than the ones I may have, and to provide you with the ability to see issues, events, and ideas from more than one point of view. With that, I'd like to introduce my guest, Aaron Richard Bakken, a very notable attorney who has lots of ideas that have nothing to do with the practice of law. He's a consummate scholar. He's a person that pays close attention to what's going on in the world, and he just happens to be about 6 times smarter than me. So, Aaron, with that, will you please say hello to our audience today?
Good morning. How is everyone doing? Good
Yeah,
morning to you, Brett.
I'm doing good. It's great to have you on the show today. Uh, you and I have had a lot of conversations late into the night about world issues and even local, regional, and personal issues that we talk about a lot, which is why I wanted you on the show
Sure.
because you have such a unique view. Before we went on, I said, "What would you like to talk about?" And you said,
Well, just, we're living in unique times, obviously. The pandemic has really heightened a lot of issues that are important to all of our lives, and it's really kind of divided us in various ways. But everybody obviously views the pandemic and the current climate through the lens in which they live. So I view it as a father of, a professional working father of three young children. I am dealing every single day with trying to raise children in this climate. It's far more difficult than I expected. And it's become far more difficult just within the last 14, 15 months. So that's something that I've been very focused on since March of last year, because it's created a lot of uncertainty in my home, in our community, and it's just something that I think that we all need to be aware of so that we can kind of get out of this quagmire that our society seems to be stuck in right now.
"Now you're a father and a husband,
That is
right?"
correct. Yeah, I have three kids, ages 7, 5, and 3. The older two are girls, and my son he's the youngest. He's 3 years old, and they've all been in school since August of last year. So we've been pretty fortunate in that regard. But we're trying to make decisions as to what we're going to do in their future, both short term and long term, and it's real difficult because it's hard to get any concise answers from community leaders, school boards, folks like that, as far as what we can expect to happen, say like in the fall of this coming year.
How tell our audience a little bit about how you grew up.
Sure. I grew up in a very small community in rural Minnesota, so southeastern Minnesota. My graduating class was 72 people. I grew up very, very blue collar community. I was working farming on my family farm, and then working construction through probably beginning around age 12. So, I mean, I was working on a dairy farm performing activities that now seem insane to me, given that I was only 5 years older at the time than my oldest child. But I was driving tractors, driving semi trucks at age 14. I was working midnight shifts, like overnight shifts, when I was in school. So I would actually leave school, go to basketball practice, and I would leave basketball practice, go to the family farm, and I would start my work shift at like 11:30 p.m. and I would work until 6:30, go home, shower, go to school. And that was not something that was at all uncommon in the community where I grew up.
Well, there was a different work ethic in those days. You and I've talked about that.
Yeah, I think it's certainly helped me as I've advanced in life, because all of those characteristics that were kind of ingrained in me were done so at a young age, as is the case with most children. But yeah, like I said, in the community where I now live with my kids, we have a lot of teenage um, neighbors and whatnot, and I don't. Most of them don't even have jobs, much less do anything even remotely close to what my friends and I and my brothers were doing when we were growing up in Minnesota.
Nothing productive.
It does not appear to be.
Of course, there's always the genius software developer that works out of his home and hacks NORAD or some such thing. But uh, you and I have talked about lots of issues. I have two grown kids, one of whom was actually a guest on the show a few weeks ago, and yours are much younger. But one of the things I'd like to find out what you think about gun control, and I'd like to hearken you back to the story of where you had a close encounter uh, involving firearms. Will you tell the audience about that?
And which specific issue are you referencing, just to be
The
so
one,
safe here?
the one where you found a bullet hole in your truck right next to
Yes,
right next
yes.
to your kid.
So, now, well, walking this back, I'm very much in favor of the gun control as it currently exists in our country. It's not something that I'm extremely passionate about. I did grow up hunting. Walking back to age 12, I was out in the woods hunting deer at that time, which again seems crazy to me now looking back, but that was very common. But I was licensed in Minnesota to carry a firearm at the age of 12. And so I've grown up around guns. I still own multiple guns. The only concern that I have in my home as it relates to guns is one of my kids getting a hold of them. So that's the only thing that really holds me back from that perspective now. But as it relates to gun control, but speaking about a very personal event that occurred to me and what is my oldest daughter Lillian about 3 years ago. I picked her up from school here in the community, and we were driving home. And to get from her school to the community in which we live, there is a dirt road that goes through some open space that has bison fenced in, bunch of bison. We see elk there routinely. I saw a herd of elk there just this morning, actually. So we drive through. It's real pretty. It's a 12-minute drive from her school to our house, but it's a very nice kind of therapeutic drive for kids like seeing the animals and whatnot. But anyways, I'm driving her home from school. Well, first I picked her up at school. I think it was 1:30 in the afternoon, sunny day in March, and it was 2018. And I walked her and put her in her car seat in the rear seat on the passenger side, just like I've done a million times. Drove her home, and when we were driving on the dirt road, I recalled hearing a metallic sound of like a rattling sound of some sorts that confused me. But at the time, I thought nothing of it. I thought that, maybe I drove over something with my tire and just kept driving home, and we had the windows down, music on, whatever. And then when we got to our house, I walked around the car to get her out, and there was a hole, a puncture in kind of the lower third area of that rear passenger door. And I thought that someone had taken a piece of a rebar or something and just jammed it in the door. I thought, we had just come from the airport, you and me, if you remember. And I
I
thought
do.
maybe something had happened out at the DIA parking lot, or, I was confused. But a bullet hole never occurred to me to be the potential cause of the hole. So I get my daughter out and drop her off, talk to my wife, see you later. And I drove back to the office here. And, I told you, I said, hey, come on here. I want to show you something. I don't know what could have caused this hole in my door. And you immediately said that's a bullet hole.
Yeah, as a guy that's spent an inordinate amount of time shooting at cars, I could tell you there is zero doubt in my mind that was a bullet.
Yeah, and as you may recall, it had a very kind of steep. The bullet had come in at a very steep trajectory at a very sharp angle.
Yeah.
We thought there may be some bullet remnants inside of that panel. But before even opening up, I called the Douglas County Sheriff's Department. They came to my house. They confirmed your suspicion. There's two deputies, and they both said this is definitely a bullet hole. So I kind of, after the fact, I was freaking out because my daughter was sitting, I don't know,
A foot.
10 inches inside of that door.
Yeah.
And if we would have been, 10, 12 inches over to the right, it would have landed on her lap or worse. And, it's something that woke me up at night for months. And to this day, I have absolutely no idea what could have caused it. I had some speculation that, we're driving through that open space. Someone could have been shooting a rifle down below the area where we were driving and shooting it in the air, and it came down at that steep trajectory. Or I also do recall that right at the area where the road transitions from asphalt to dirt, there was a truck sitting on the side of the road, and there were three males. Two were in the back, like in the bed of the truck, and one was just walking around. But I do remember hearing like a thud of sorts as we drove past that vehicle, and it's possible that one of them purposefully or accidentally shot down from the bed of the truck into my car. Maybe they were trying to hit the rear tire. I have no idea, but it was, a terrifying life event.
I can understand that for sure. One thing I ran for the excuse me, I ran for the Colorado legislature in 2010, and I was asked in some of the interviews that I gave to various newspaper outlets and TV stations what was my stance on gun control. And I used to sort of mystify my audience by saying I believe in gun control, and I think stance plays a role in that. And I was torn between the Weaver stance and the isosceles stance. And I ran as a Democrat, even though I'd been a Republican most of my life. And I said that, and the audience just would stare at me like I was talking Chinese. And if I'd been speaking to Republicans, I think they would have gotten it, and they'd have started telling me, "Why don't you shoot isosceles?" Or some such thing. But I'm an avid shooter. I train multiple times a year at good schools like Gunsight Academy down in Paulden, Arizona, and with great instructors like Larry Vickers and Robbie Latham and people like that. And I am in favor of gun control, but I think that we have to be careful. The argument against gun control is that once you start to make it okay to heavily legislate who can own a gun, we're now on what the gun proponents call a slippery slope, because once we start, it'd be like being on a water slide. There's no backing up, and the next thing you know, the Second Amendment is out the window. I personally don't agree with that. I think that we are at a point in time where some measure of gun control is important. You probably remember very well here in Colorado, about 2 months ago, we had 10 people killed at a King Soopers in Boulder by a single assailant who happened to have an Arabic last name.
I was at that King Soopers, or near that King Soopers, about a week and a half ago, and it's still under complete lockdown. It's all fenced in, and there were local deputies standing outside, like guarding, and I assume for evidentiary reasons.
Yeah, and the trauma that inflicted on the Boulder community. My daughter lives in Boulder and shops in that store, or used to, and she's also a highly trained combat shooter. She can clear a house. She knows how to do it at night with a flashlight and so on. But the idea is that is a guy who clearly shouldn't have had access to a firearm. The question for society is, how do you tell the difference between him and someone who really deserves to be able to carry a weapon with a concealed weapons permit for self-defense? The media sort of downplays those stories where an active shooter scenario is brought to an abrupt halt by someone who happens to be legally carrying a concealed weapon. Those stories just don't persist in the media the way criminal shootings do. And but nonetheless, I am in favor of gun control, but very moderate levels of gun control.
Yeah, and
How do you feel on that?
no, I agree with you. I think the gun control issues are more of a mental health issue primarily, almost in almost every instance with the mass shooting. We find out that the individual who the perpetrator is deeply disturbed in various ways, and I don't think the shooting necessarily had anything to do with gun control. It had to do with a person who had become unhinged and was kind of an outcast in society, and that was obviously the case with the Boulder shooter. The media is going to run with their narratives always. We know that, and as soon as when it was a white guy shoots up a store in Colorado, this was yet another example of how terrible our society is, and we need gun control. And then as soon as his real identity is discovered and disclosed to the public, that story disappeared from the national discussion almost immediately. And they're going to push the agenda on gun control.
What's your take on why that happened?
And why
the gun control issue was detached from the Boulder King Super shooting once the identity of the shooter was released?
Well, in almost every instance, in my opinion, this is, a lot of people would disagree with this, but as soon as it's anyone other than a white male, then the media is going to suppress the discussion about that, because then we get into uncomfortable racial issues, like allegations of xenophobia, things like that, and it's uncomfortable for people to talk about, and the media just buries it. I mean, if you want to look at gun control, look no further than my former residence, Chicago. Illinois has some of the most stringent gun laws on the books in the country, and Chicago is a war zone. I mean, I read yesterday there's been there were I want to say 43 shootings in Chicago this past weekend, and this happens like clockwork every single year in Chicago, and has been the case since certainly I've been an adult and aware of it. Spring rolls around, the weather heats up, and there are massive numbers of shootings every single weekend in Chicago. And I think your average number of murders on a given weekend in Chicago is it's at least five, and I think that's a real low estimate. You'll have like holiday weekends, Fourth of July, Memorial Day, where you'll have triple digit shootings, not deaths, but shootings, and in the city like confines, like not I'm not talking about the greater Chicagoland, just in the city, and everybody just like oh it just continues, nothing changes.
Well, it's interesting. The murder rate in third world countries is not something I'm familiar with, but I know they have murders. But you read occasionally about someone who's been killed with a blunt object, like a fireplace poker, a bat, or a stick, or a knife. Uh, Someday, somebody somewhere is going to advocate knife control, because people get stabbed with knives and have been since the medieval days or before that. But when we focus on you and I having sort of a generational split between us, because you're 20 years younger than me,
Yeah.
your kids are 20 years younger than my kids. As you look forward and as we talk about some of the experiences you've had with your kids' schools and so forth, as well as their friends, it sounds to me like you're staring down the barrel, no pun intended, of a future that is going to be very, very different for you as a parent than it was for my father or for me. Uh, Tell us a little bit about some of the things you've been discussing with me when we're not on the show about disturbing signals you're getting out of your kids' school.
Sure. Well, I think a lot of this relates back to social media. That this is something that I recognize being a problem, at least for someone like myself, that immediately upon my first foray into social media, which I was only on for probably about 7, 8 months back in 2000. It was right after my daughter was born, so 2013. And I just realized how toxic it was for me because I was spending considerable amounts of time staring at my phone, being stressed about what types of messaging, affirmations I was receiving from my friends. I was on Instagram, and that was it. But like, if someone didn't like a picture of my daughter, I would get upset and offended. And eventually, I was like, "What are you doing?" And I got off of it. But my wife she's maintained a presence on social media for beginning around the same time, and she still has some social media today. But I can just see the pollution that it causes amongst very otherwise healthy adults, and that trickles down to these kids. And and we're now reaching the point where we have the first generation of social media, like kind of that generation is becoming adults, and they're obsessed with this stuff. So it's very important to me to keep my kids off of social media for as long as I can, because I already see children in my 7-year-old's class, so she's in first grade, who are walking around with cell phones. There's some restrictions on the phones that I've seen, but they're already on Snapchat and whatnot at age 7, and I think that is going to cause great harm in their life because they're not living in reality. And so it's important to me to keep my kids grounded for as long as possible. That seems almost impossible in the climate that we live in now.
It sure does.
I know that they're going to, by the time they hit 10, 11 years old, I know almost all of their friends are going to be on social media and have their accounts, and I don't honestly have any idea how to stop that. I'm just going to do the best that I can to mitigate it and to make sure that they're living in reality and not living inside of their phone, because to me that's very destructive.
Yeah, the messages and the mental pollution that can be poured into the impressionable mind of a young child by a cell phone doesn't seem to be a big deal. But if you actually look at what's happening, it's a huge deal. Uh, as I said, we had my daughter on a few weeks ago, and she was talking about suicides that happened in her high school, and how utterly devastating that is for everyone in the school when one person does that, let alone a shooting. And she was at Arapahoe High School, And my oldest daughter was the closest person to the shooter at Arapahoe when he first fired his first round with a shotgun down the hallway.
How close was she to the shooter?
She was about 8 feet away.
Wow.
She was inside the threshold of her classroom, but the shooter was standing in the hallway right outside that door.
Was he shooting into her classroom?
No, he shot down the hallway. And so the teacher went over, and the doors had just been reinforced to be bulletproof. And so the teacher very bravely just reached across this guy's field of view, slammed the door shut. And then, of course, we started getting very disturbing text messages from my daughter, who is now locked down in a building where there was incendiary devices, meaning bombs, in this case, Molotov cocktails thrown in the library. And I was thinking back to a situation, and I think it was in the Ukraine, where terrorists came in and took possession of a school with young kids in it, and they blew the school up. And I didn't interview, I rather rudely questioned a member of the state militia that was posted around the school. And I said, "What's the evacuation plan?" No idea. "Who's in command of the scene?" No idea. There's one known shooter down. Yes, there is. You don't know if there's more shooters? No. But you know that somebody brought incendiary devices into the building? Yes. And then he wants me to help push all the parents back another 50 yards from the building. My daughter's in there.
Yeah.
And I almost went insane with grief, frustration, and fear. And my daughter's in there. And I was armed, and I thought, I'm going to just go in there and solve this myself. Well, clearly you're not going to do something like that. And especially when there's ambulances, fire trucks, police cruisers, SWAT vehicles all around the building. You just have to sort of sit there and hope that these professionals don't botch it. But the one I spoke to had no idea what was going on in the building. And it was 3.5 hours before they let my daughter out of that building.
And what year is this?
Well, it's, you can Google it.
It was 10 years ago?
Yeah, about 10 years ago. It was when Claire Davis was shot in the head. The second round that was fired by the shooter was at a young girl named Claire Davis, and she lingered for a week and then expired. And they built this meditation area outside the school. They call it Clarity Commons in honor of Claire Davis and what she gave up, her life. But as a parent, we've had 2 school shootings in the southern Denver area. We had the big one at Columbine, then we had the one at Arapahoe. And I'm thinking, all right, gun control is one thing, but kids taking assault rifles to school, nobody can seriously contend there's any legitimacy to that. And how did the kids get the assault rifles?
Yeah, that's a parenting issue to me, not a gun control issue.
I agree 100%. But one of the articles I read said the shooter in Boulder a month ago had only had that, he had an assault rifle, and he'd only had it for 6 days. But when I read that he had 10 fatalities and no one wounded, that speaks to me of some level of marksmanship skill.
Yeah.
It sounds like, one bullet, one kill, not to sound too crass on a terrible, sensitive subject, but it sounds like he knew how to shoot because people shoot up stores throughout the country, at least monthly. And there's lots and lots of times where people are wounded, but no one dies. That also speaks to the marksmanship skill of the assailant. So a lot of interesting questions there. The city attorney in Boulder said it would be another year before they had solid findings because they were investigating lots of different angles. The shooter had an Arabic surname, and that could open up ideas about whether he's tied to an extremist group or something like that. But I think it's just another nutcase. I don't think it has those sexy diabolical intrigues associated with it. I think it's just a question of somebody who went bonkers one day and decided to shoot up a store.
What do you think it is about the climate in Colorado that leads to all of these mass shootings? Because our crime numbers from a national perspective are pretty low. I love living here. I feel very safe with my family living here, but I have friends all over the country, and they joke to me all the time that we're the nutcase mass shooting state, and we've earned that reputation. Do you have any thoughts as to what creates that climate?
Well, my own personal view on that, because I've given it a lot of thought, is that insanity is contagious. And if you're around insane impulses or insane behavior patterns, insane speech long enough, it'll start to percolate into your mind insidiously in ways that you're not consciously even aware of. And I think that we've got so many, and I've talked about this on a lot of other episodes of Viewpoint, but we've got so many ultra extreme views clashing with each other today. There's no middle ground left. And I think that what that does is it unhinges people's sense of ethics, morality, and reality. And it becomes almost a pandemic of its own, but it's a pandemic of extreme aberration and the thought process someone goes through to decide it's okay to shoot up a store. Where does that thinking begin? And if we could start to integrate that level of awareness into the way we interact with each other in society, I think that that would be the beginning of the solution. But it's so hard and it's so amorphous. It's such a vague goal that I'm throwing out that people say, well, how do we do that? Especially with all the noise of the drastically opposed viewpoints that we have in this country on all the main issues that we see now.
Every issue, basically.
I'm involved in a lawsuit today that involves a police use of force claim, and I'm representing a city in that matter. And the plaintiff's lawyer in that case constantly says to me that we should settle for lots and lots of money because everyone hates cops so much in this country that there's nothing going to stop the jury, in my case, from awarding huge numbers, even though the injury that was sustained by the plaintiff, which is the person who brings the lawsuit, was minimal, and or at least appears to have been minimal. Uh, and so, but as a lawyer, I look at jury demographics, and it's part of my job to know how people will react to signals. When we pick a jury, when we formulate a jury argument, we have to know who we have on our jury, and we have to know if they have buttons that lead to extreme viewpoints that could change the outcome of a trial. This is true in criminal cases that I don't do, and it's true in civil cases that I do. But the initial thought triggers, that this is a mechanic that we study from the standpoint of psychology, you and I together, as we plan out how we're going to do trial presentations. And and I think it starts with the first thoughts, and there's a point where they start to, their chain of thought, people who do these things, starts to run off in a direction that maybe a year earlier they would have sworn would never happen to them. I remember watching the video of the one of the women that had raided the Capitol, and she said, we tried to find Nancy Pelosi so we could put a bullet in her freaking brain, but we couldn't find her. And she's saying this on social media. It goes viral, and I'm thinking, you know, where would you make the transition as an individual from what I'm assuming at some point in her life was a law abiding, decent, honest citizen to someone who's actively trying to kill a politician inside the Capitol because she disagrees with the lady's viewpoint?
Well, it's like the woman who was killed in that riot.
Yeah.
I mean, she. Otherwise, I did some investigation into her background. She's former military, seemed to be an upstanding citizen. I don't know what it takes for a person to get from living what seemed to be a pretty normal American life to becoming so unhinged that you're actually trying to storm a Capitol and it ends up costing you your life.
Well, you told me a couple of days ago in my, in my office, you told me this story about, it wasn't really a story, it was more an observation that schools are starting to expose children to notions about sexuality
Oh yeah.
when they're very much, in my mind, very much too young to be hearing about sex at all. And we're explaining to kids that are 6, 7, and 8 years of age what trans is, what queer is, what bisexual is, pansexual, LGBTQ. And the idea is to foster an idea of social tolerance in young people. But this is what 10 years ago, even as recently as that, would be talked about as you know fringe practices. And I don't want to draw the ire of my listeners because I have a great deal of tolerance I'm an avid believer that someone's sexuality should not be regulated by society as a whole, but teaching young kids about sexual practices under the heading of social tolerance, and we're talking about sexual things. We have young kids deciding that they're the opposite gender just because it's spoken of with respect, dignity, and fondness in the schools, and they're not old enough to have a libido. So how in the world would they know, what sexuality really even means for them? When my youngest daughter was real young, and I mean 7, she announced to my wife and I that she was gay because there'd been so much, gay pride media coverage and so on. And she didn't have a libido. She didn't know what gay even meant, but she was swearing up and down that she was gay. Now that she's older and has a libido, she's very much a heterosexual person. And but it's interesting, those ideas got planted in an impressionable young mind.
Yeah, it's always delivered under the heading of equality and fairness, and you have empathy, and you need to listen to these children and let them make these decisions. But I wouldn't let my 7-year-old daughter pick out her outfit for school on most days, much less touch anything remotely associated with sexuality. At that age, I'm living in this space right now. I'm aware of schools throughout the country that have trans reading day, for instance. We're at like on a Friday afternoon, they have a trans person come in and read to the kids and young kids, like kids my age, or my kids' age. And that horrifies me. Not because I have anything against trans people, not at all, but I just don't want any of those ideas being put upon or put in my kids' heads because they don't think about that stuff on their own. The only way that they would possibly have any thoughts associated with that, just like Katie, announcing she was gay, is their environment and what they're being exposed to. And I think it's wildly unhealthy to be exposing young kids, even teenagers, to that. They become adults and want to make a decision as to their sexuality, their gender, whatever it is. Have at it. I have nothing against any of that, but I I have a friend, or it's my wife's friend, who they were kind of tip of the spear with this. Probably 10 years ago, they had a little boy who I went to several of his birthday parties when he's 5, 6, 7 years old. And when he was 8, he just announced he wanted to be a girl. And they actually had, medications, hormone treatment, all of that. Now it's done. He's officially a woman. He changed everything, and he's still only 16 years old. And there are groups out there now, like, people who have these surgeries or change their genders, and they regret it. They become adults and they're like, well, I don't even know what I was thinking. And to me, it's like the most obvious thing in the world. Like, of course you didn't know what you're doing. You're 7. You don't know anything about life. You're reading books and watching cartoons, not thinking about sexuality. So it is probably the thing in society that horrifies me most about this real strong progressive push that we're being exposed to, all of us, every day.
Well, you told me that you've been reading about articles where some states were considering legislation that would prohibit parents from being able to step in and prevent a gender reassignment surgery with a very young kid.
Oh, that's in the works in many areas of the country. It's always kind of characterized, anything opposed to trans is like anti-trans, when that's the wrong way of looking at it. Like, you hear a lot of, one of the areas of focus now is sports. Are they going to allow in high schools, and I guess in colleges too? Are they going to allow? Let me get this wrong. Trans female? Am I saying that right? Trans males. So no, trans females. So people who were born biologically as males, are they going to allow those people to compete in female sports when they get older? Because there's an inherent advantage, obviously, just from a skeletal perspective, muscular perspective, that makes biological males, perform at a much higher level than females in sports. And to me, this is the most obvious thing in the world. Everyone knows that we have we have boys and girls sports for a reason. It's for fairness. So, but there's all this legislation now about, permitting these trans athletes to compete, against the girls, for instance. So I got a trans female competing against my girls in track when they're in high school. Well, that's not fair at all to my girls, but it's almost always characterized as being unfair to the trans people. And you're kind of completely forgetting about all the young biological females who just want to have a fair competition, but they're kind of silenced or ignored in all of this, which is very confusing to me.
I agree with that. I can tell you, just as an aside, under the heading of acceptance of gender differences, to me it started uh, way back in the past when a woman named Esther Hobart Morris advocated in Wyoming that women should have the right to vote. And I'm very proud because I'm from Wyoming originally, and I'm very proud to say that Wyoming was the first state in the union who allow women the right to vote in elections. There's a statue of her outside the Capitol in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and kids grow up hearing about Esther Hobart Morris fighting for women's rights. And in my mind, that's very different than trying to explain to a 7-year-old why someone dresses up as the opposite gender or even wants to talk about their gender reassignment surgery. There's a very famous lawyer in Denver uh, who's older than me, and I'm old, and I'm 62 years old. And this lawyer, very famous guy, decided to have a gender reassignment surgery. His law firm was 100% supportive of that. He changed his first name to a female first name, had sexual gender reassignment surgery, and it opened up a lot of weird conversations among Denver lawyers that some were extremely tolerant of this person's gender change, and people that are listening to the podcast in Denver may figure out who I'm talking about, but because this person was so famous in the law and practiced in the same field you do, you have a national practice in construction defect litigation, and so did this person.
Yeah,
And
I remember. I recall when you sent me a text message with a photograph, and I was only confused. I had no idea what you were sending me. It was I didn't understand the context, but it was a confusing message to receive.
well, as an old guy, I grew up in a society that sort of, it was taboo not to be your gender, that you were born with. And so the idea of people being gay, I examined that issue closely. I read the Supreme Court opinion on the Amendment 2 dispute in Colorado, which involved a prohibition of laws that would be favorable to protect gay people. And that law was deemed unconstitutional by the United States Supreme Court. When I read the opinion, it completely galvanized me into believing that there should be protection for people who are gay. Well, gay was gay. It meant if you're a female, you're a lesbian. If you're a male, you're uh, whatever the proper term would be there without getting weird. But the concept now is, we only have two genders, and there's male and female. And if a male identifies as a female but hasn't had surgery or has had surgery, we've broken it down now into so many permutations and combinations that it's really hard to keep track of. And I'm not against it. As again I said, I'm a big believer in individual liberty and the protection of individual rights. Uh, but society has been now completely fixated with this. There's so much media attention to the idea of it. And that seems strange to me because when a person decides what their sexuality pattern is going to be in their life, that's a personal decision and it should be left personal. It should be protected, but it shouldn't be paraded, because I think once we start to parade anybody's sexuality, even I'm a heterosexual male. My pronouns are him and his, or whatever.
He, I believe.
He, him, his, uh, the little bald man's, whatever you want to say. But the idea is, I grew up heterosexual with a strong libido, but I didn't talk about it all the time. Obviously I wanted to have a girlfriend. I wanted to date girls, but I didn't make a big deal out of the fact that I was heterosexual. And people would say, well, it's all different. You're mixing apples and chainsaws here. I mean, you can say that it was okay because you were in the accepted norm. You weren't in the abused minority. And I get that. I truly do. But why so much attention to this every day in the media?
I heard, I listened to a podcast. This is probably a year ago, and I believe the gentleman's name is Douglas Murray. He's British. I'm not exactly sure what his background is. He comments on political issues, cultural issues, and he's definitely conservative leaning. I don't know to what degree, but he had an interesting theory, or a theory that I found to be interesting, is that in the toppling of civilizations throughout history, there was always an area immediately preceding kind of the fall of the Roman Empire, the Greeks, all that, where there was all this gender confusion. And his point made a lot of sense to me because books that I've read, to whatever degree you want to believe a movie that you're watching, but there was, like, in the Roman times, you see a lot of kind of mixing of the genders, of weird sex stuff that was confusing to me at the time when I was young, but now it's like, are we kind of in the midst or at the beginning of the downfall of the United States being, the global superpower? Is this kind of the lead into that? Because it has been a pattern throughout history. And he had a couple of, it wasn't just Greek and Rome. He had a couple of other um, cultures that kind of fell or went by the wayside. And they had similar experiences with the sex stuff that a few decades prior to what I'll call their official downfall. And I found that to ring somewhat true because we're obviously, as a country, we're kind of coming apart at the seams in many different ways. But yeah, what is this imposition of all of this gender and sex stuff? It's mostly confuses me.
Yeah, and you see these trends that have become subjects of obsessive fixation in this country. Like, we have so many police shootings, we have so many hate crimes. It seems like every day I see something where somebody gets brutally attacked for their gender, for their selected gender, for their race,
I see a lot of Asian attacks.
Asian, and cops shooting black people. We saw so much of that in the last 3 years. And people would say, well, if you weren't so damned ignorant, Godfrey, you would know that's been around since long before the Civil War. And I get that too. But it wasn't as well known to the population. And maybe it's because now it's long past time to get public awareness on the fact that if you're an African American and you get pulled over by a cop, you may not have the same expectation of safety that you would if you were uh, a Caucasian person. And if we put the spotlight on that, maybe we can do something about it. But at the same time, I find myself wondering, how hard is it to get the word out to the average beat cop that if you're going to shoot a black person, you damn well better have a really well documented reason. I'm a huge fan of body cameras.
Yeah, they're very
Um,
helpful.
but the idea is, how are we not able to train our police better? Then I read about initiatives to defund the police.
Which clearly doesn't
It's,
work.
it's going to go in the exact opposite direction. You'll only draw the dregs of society if you're paying trivial wages. You need money to train police. You need money to recruit good candidates, uh, the kind of people you want to have in uniform. Defunding the police is going to make the problem worse, not better, in my opinion.
Well, all of the states or the locales where that kind of started this, almost a year ago after the Chauvin George Floyd incident, they're already walking that back. It was all theatrics, and they're going to decrease their police budget and all of this reimagining. I never heard the term reimagine, a year ago in my life, and now I hear reimagining every day. It seems like, and they're going to have all these utopian ideas as to how to police or take care of our populace, and they've already walked that back. They're increasing the budgets all over the place, including in my home state, Minnesota, because the crime rate, and specifically the murder rate, is through the roof. 2020 had the highest murder rate in the country in the past 50 years, but for, I want to say, 1995. So we had the second highest murder rate, and certainly in my lifetime, and we're way ahead of the pace now for 2021 than we were at this time last year. So, I mean, I think you can expect the murder rate to increase by 30 to 40% for the 2021 year, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that we had all this messaging: defund the police, cops are evil. I had never imagined a world that would exist where I had to like defend cops so much, but now I actually feel terrible for a lot of them because they're put in a terrible position routinely, and they have to make split-second decisions, and, you know, I'm obviously, there are some bad cops out there. What Chauvin did was horrible, but there's also a lot of incidents where these guys are making decisions in the blink of an eye, and they don't wanna do the wrong thing because their lives are over. Everybody thinks that there's some sort of evil intent behind, what these cops do, I think the best example is, sadly, another Minnesota incident in Brooklyn Center where that female cop clearly thought she was using her taser to direct it at a person who was resisting arrest, and she shoots him and kills him, and it was awful. But everybody's talking about racism and these horrible cops. That woman didn't want to do that, that cop, because her life is now over. She's probably going to go to jail.
Well, let me play devil's advocate with you on that one. Because again, on viewpoint, we have multiple viewpoints. My goal in this podcast is to get people to realize there's always lots of different viewpoints that you can look at any subject with, and being able to do that is a great skill. And I encourage our audience to think about the idea there's more than one point of view, and sometimes the other point of view is better than the one you've got. But I like to just
Probably most of the time.
share different ones. But the video went viral, and the officer pulled out her Glock and is pointing the Glock, and she would have pulled it from the right, the 3 o'clock holster position, and would have seen the weapon in her own hand while she's shrieking. She's obviously hysterical, screaming, "Taser, taser, taser." And it wasn't a command voice. It sounded like somebody who was just one blood cell shy of going completely unhinged. Taser, taser, taser. And the person is sitting completely motionless, and bam, she lets one round loose, realizes, oh shit, that was my Glock. That wasn't my taser. Taser comes from the other side of the body.
Yeah.
So I personally have viewed that, because I watch a lot of videos of shootings just to study the mechanics of how shootings happen, and studying the active shooter scenario. But that person in the car may have been resisting arrest earlier, but at the moment of the shooting was sitting stock still. The video shows that. And so why pull the trigger at all? But how do you not notice that what's in your hand is a Glock? They don't look like tasers. Tasers and Glocks don't look alike. And how does she miss the fact that she pulled her firearm, not her taser, that it's a firearm she holds in her hand, and then feels this need to squeeze the trigger? Whether it was a taser or a firearm, at that moment, was it necessary to squeeze any trigger?
I would say probably not, yeah.
But I think that officer was completely overwhelmed for whatever reason. She found herself panicking to the point where her judgment was gone. I don't think she intended to shoot a guy and then call it an accidental firearm use as opposed to a taser use. I just don't think that's what happened.
No, I agree with that. Again, why would she choose to end her career? Certainly, her life as she knows it. I can't imagine there was an intent, but I think there's, if you want to have like a healthy discussion about training, and which certainly needs to happen, talk about why she thought it was necessary to shoot that gentleman with a taser, because that was unnecessary too. He had at least one, maybe two adult male police officers standing within a foot and a half of him. I don't think it was necessary to pull the trigger of any type of a weapon, and that's a very valid argument. But everything always gets rolled right back into the cops are racist and all this stuff, and I think that the more that we kind of compile that narrative is only going to create more situations like we saw in that particular incident, because these cops, like in a place like Minneapolis, are living under an immense amount of stress. For a year they've been told how horrible they are, and they're pigs, and there was a witness who was an expert of sorts, who got a pig's head put on his front doorstep. He was a defense expert in the Chauvin trial. I mean, you can't speak. These cops can't voice their positions at all because they're under full assault from the media, from the politicians. The president of the country comes on, to basically pressure the jury immediately after they get released to go out to start, contemplating the evidence they saw in the Chauvin trial. Biden's on the national TV 10 seconds later saying, "I hope they come up with the right verdict," and all this, and it's kind of scary stuff. I don't know if you saw this, but there is, I know Vardyar's near and dear to your heart. there's a big issue.
And let me stop you for the audience. Voir dire is the process of jury selection, and it's a fine art. But jury selection is the non-legal term for voir dire.
The the attorney Eric Nelson for Chauvin filed the motion, I believe, this morning for a new trial, based on a number of reasons. One, failure to sequester the jury. There were some politicians that were going to Minneapolis to kind of rile up the protesters in advance of sequestration. But then there was also one of the jurors, he's being identified as Juror 52, has come out openly. He's given public interviews on TV. He's talked, I believe, the Times, Wall Street Journal have interviewed him, but he has openly admitted to the fact that he had an agenda. He wanted to get on that jury, and they've since went back and dug through his social media accounts. And he's attending some Black Lives Matter protests. He had there was one picture that I saw of him with a "Take Your Knee Off of Our Neck" kind of shirt with a George Floyd's picture. But he's openly admitting that he had motive for getting on that jury, and that is one of the bases that Nelson just filed a mistrial. So now they're, from what I understand, they're going to go back and take a look at the jury questionnaire to see if he made any misrepresentations about what he actually knew about the case, because more so than any case in our life, probably since at least OJ, it was impossible not to know what happened with the George Floyd Chauvin incident. Everybody in the world basically knew that within a couple of days of when it occurred. But a lot of these jurors are saying, well, I didn't really know anything about it. I saw a picture or whatever. And he was a jury who made some of those representations in his jury questionnaire. But now they're going to go back and examine that. And I think from the expectation is the judge is going to have an evidentiary hearing to see if the disclosures that he made about his knowledge of the incident prior to the trial were in fact accurate.
Well, you and I both know that overturning a jury verdict is difficult to do. It's not impossible. We've both done it in certain cases with either motions to the court after a verdict is entered or during the appellate process. It's not that easy to overturn a jury verdict, but I think that if the Derek Chauvin conviction is overturned, we're going to see people say protests is the proper term to use. I use the word riots. When you start breaking windows and throwing bricks and things like that, you've gone from a peaceful protest to a riot at that stage. Public vandalism, public assaults, et cetera, et cetera. But, I shudder to think what would happen if they overturned that. But as a lawyer, if there was an irregularity in the trial, I avidly believe that Derek Chauvin needed to have a fair trial, as every criminal. If we start with the idea they're criminals, we're starting off wrong. There's a presumption of innocence in the country, and the trial process has to be fair for people to have faith in their system. And so, it'd be interesting to see. I'm not sure I'd want to be that trial judge.
Yeah, but, it seems there's just the climate's too hot. There's too much political pressure. It seems hard to expect any sort of granting of a motion for a new trial. But it is an interesting issue that we're now because we're also connected through the media, through social media, I should say. We have people, citizens, acknowledging the fact that they're trying to get on juries for political purposes, and I think we can expect to see a lot more of this as we have more of these, quote unquote hate crimes that are captured on video and whatnot.
Yeah, I was selected for jury duty about 10 years ago, and I made no bones about the fact I was trying to be a low-key juror, because in reality, the jury that actually sits on a case tends to be comprised of the people about whom the lawyers on each side know the least. The more they know about a juror, the more likely it is that that juror is a high-profile target for consideration. One side or the other will exercise a peremptory challenge and strike that juror. The ones that you don't know anything about because they're really quiet, those are the ones that make it onto a jury. And so I was selected for jury duty, and I went in and I sat there in my Mr. Rogers sweater with a caterpillar ball cap on my head. Anything that says I am not a lawyer, And so I'm sitting there and I'm sort of slunk down in my seat, and I'm answering the questions with this voice that barely carries across the courtroom. And I generally don't need a microphone in court. And then finally the judge starts to bellow. I can't take another minute of this. And I'm like giving him the death stare, like ixnay on the calling me out, stop it. And and the judge is a personal friend of mine, but he's like, "You gentlemen have no idea who you're even talking to, do you?" And I'm like, "Who, me?" So he says, "This lawyer has more trial experience than both of you put together just in this court." And I'm thinking, oh, yeah, the cat's out of the bag now, because I just sort of muttered that I work for a law firm, and they said, "Are you trying to get on the jury?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And they asked me, this was the prosecutor, asked me, "Why do you want to be on the jury?" And I said, "Well, why do you think?" And he thinks about it for me. He says, "So you can see what goes on back in the jury room?"
Yeah,
I said,
gather intel.
"Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm a trial lawyer. I've never been in a jury room. I've talked to jurors after trial, but I wanted to see it." And I swore an oath. I said, "I won't let them make me into the foreman. I won't try to use my lawyer skills to persuade the jury of anything. I'll be the quiet man in the corner. I just want to see how it works back in that room, that mysterious room, whatever happens back there. I'd like to see it firsthand." We've done lots of simulations with mock juries where we videotape their deliberations, and that helps. But seeing a real jury
Yeah.
would be really good. Well, next thing you know, the people think and excuse Mr. Godfrey.
Yeah. Have a nice day.
And so I got out of my Mr. Rogers uniform, put on my lawyer costume, and went on with my day. But it made me feel bad that the judge had to make an issue out of that,
Yeah.
because I think I was going to get on the jury.
Well, I do think we're going to be seeing a lot of this. Not for not for your own intel gathering perspective or a lawyer's intel gathering perspective, but I think a lot of people who are politically motivated are going to try to get on juries of these highly publicized cases.
Well, I believe that a citizen has a right to serve on a jury. It's part of participating in your government. And I think that if they strike you with a peremptory challenge because they don't like which way you comb your hair, that's their right as an attorney to do that, as long as it's not a racially motivated striking of a juror, which can be picked up with patterns sometimes, and people have heard about that. But I think that the right to trial by jury is sacrosanct and should be protected at all costs, both civil and criminal cases. Many countries you don't have a right to a jury, and lots of countries you don't have a right to a jury in a civil case, which is the opposite of a criminal case. It's usually a lawsuit for money damages. But when I look at the Chauvin trial, and I think to myself, if Chauvin goes to prison, this may be a controversial point of view, but I don't think it is. If he goes to prison, he's a dead man, either by his own hand or by someone else's hand. But it's well known police officers do not do well in prison. Uh, Everybody wants him dead the minute they arrive. The likelihood then is, what we're saying is, Chauvin goes to prison, even for a short period of time, it would be a death sentence, in my opinion. So we have to make sure the trial was fair, and we have to make sure the trial appeared to be fair. So that judge, as I said, he's got a hard job in front of him now.
From the brief material that I read related to this motion for a new trial, I think the judge has a pretty good get out of jail free card, no pun intended, in that he can put it back on Chauvin's counsel, Nelson, and say, well, if you would have done your job in questioning this juror, you would have got to the root of his political beliefs and ideologies and whatnot. And it's your fault that you just didn't ask the right questions. And I think he's going to be able to deny the motion on that basis. Again, I just read this morning, so but that seemed to make a lot of sense and is a good way for the judge to avoid being a target himself of hatred. That
Yeah.
poor judge, if he goes and grants a new trial.
But think of this, though, Aaron. There is such a thing as reversing a case at the appellate level based on ineffective assistance of counsel.
Yeah.
So if the judge makes comments like, "Well, you screwed up in your voir dire," then that could open up an appeal and a reversal based on ineffective assistance of counsel, which is more conspicuous than simply having a juror conceal their true views in the jury selection process.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I could definitely see this judge, his name is escaping me, but punting this to the appellate level.
Yeah, I think if I were the judge, I would probably be tempted to do that, but still, district judge, trial judge has a duty to be a good judge and to rule properly on post-trial motions as well as pre-trial motions. as well as objections during trial. I mean, the idea that you have a super high profile trial, I've always assumed when I was younger that judges would aspire to that because it's exciting and sexy and glamorous. And every judge I've ever asked that question to said, "Oh, spare me from the high profile case. It's the last thing I want in my courtroom."
Yeah, this judge, I do recall, when the jury went out, Nelson did make a motion for mistrial based primarily on political pressures from politicians, from Congress people from other states showing up in Minneapolis to get the crowd riled up. And I believe he used the word abhorrent as far as their behaviors. He didn't want all of that attention on the trial just because of the influence that it's obviously going to have on a jury. He still obviously didn't grant that motion for mistrial, but he made some pretty strong statements. And there is the possibility that there's a cumulative effect of all of these different issues. Not one, not the politician showing up, and not just this juror issue, but there's an accumulation of enough issues that he could go the other way. But I I highly doubt it.
Well, it'll be interesting to see. Let me ask you this question, and we're almost out of time, but let me put this question to you. As a father, with all these balls in the air, so to speak, what worries you the most in terms of the way things will unfold in society over the next 5 years, maybe even the next 10? Speaking as a parent, what sits at the top of your list of concerns?
Yeah, I would go with the messaging out there that white people are evil. There's an inherent evilness to whiteness. We always hear about whiteness now.
White guilt, white privilege.
Yeah, all the privilege, all the stuff. I didn't really see a lot of white privilege when I was working at my grandpa's dairy farm at 3 a.m. But apparently, I have all of this privilege, and I don't like that messaging to my children because they can't change who they are. They have white skin. My daughters are going to get it. My son even more so as a male.
Now,
That
surely you realize that as you sit here saying that, there will be listeners that say, "Oh man, he's anything but woke. He doesn't get it. He's really a redneck. He's a racist. He's probably one of the guys that would have been in the Klan if he lived in the South." Just because you're saying that pressure against whites under the headings of white privilege or white supremacy or uh, any label you want to use. And by the way, I think labels are awful because they turn your brain off when you start using them. But there are going to be people out there. They're going to call you a redneck. They're going to call you a cracker. They're going to call you prejudiced against blacks or against some other race. What would you say to them?
No, that's fine. I know who I am. I know how I behave in life. I know what my interactions are with people in my workplace, obviously my family, my community. I'm none of those things, and I just get upset at any type of political viewpoint. The trans issue, the critical race theory, any of that type of messaging being put upon my children. That's my concern. I'm their parent. I can raise them. Thus far, I believe they're all excellent children. They're happy. I like to expose them to all different areas of life, whether that be different types of people, different places,
But not sex.
but not sex. I don't want that word anywhere near their brain for at least 5 or 6 more years.
Do you talk to your kids about race?
No, not at all.
Do you think you should?
Well, I mean, my oldest child makes comments as to obviously being aware that some of her classmates, for instance, have different skin color, and we'll talk about that. But it's very surface level. It's my position on that is the same thing with the trans. Like, I don't want to put too much in her young brain, and I want her to kind of figure out some things in the world on her own. If she has questions, I'm more than happy to have that discussion with her. But right now, I just want her to learn to read and write and play with her friends.
What do you think about the notion that people who haven't been raised in such a privileged household as your children are being raised uh, are competing for jobs with people who grew up with what we loosely are calling today white privilege? So we have children growing up in the inner city, especially black children, but also every race, including some white kids who don't have the literacy, don't have the work ethic, don't have the study skills to compete, and that somehow we need to change society so that employers can't discriminate on the basis of education work ethic, attitude, or ability, because whole sections of society were raised not to have those values. What do you say about that?
Well, first of all, it's terrible, and I certainly recognize that. But, again, I lived in Chicago. I saw a lot of that firsthand in the African American community. I grew up in a rural area of the country that had a lot of poor people, so I view it as more of a class issue than a race issue. But yeah, I want everyone to have equal opportunities in life. It's that simple. What bothers me is, I'm 42 years old now, and I've been hearing the same narrative from whichever side of the aisle you sit on. You hear the same narratives again and again. It's been my whole adult life. And the politicians don't actually ever do anything to help the communities in which they purport to care about so much. They don't actually implement new policies. They ignore mass violence in urban areas. None of it gets any attention from our media, and we just keep going on about our ways. The media gets their revenue, the politicians get reelected, and we're on this hamster wheel that it seems like we can never get off. So I want, again, equality of opportunity for everyone, every 7-year old, every 5-year old, any of my children's contemporaries. But I don't know if that's even remotely realistic.
Well, it is interesting. I think the more we talk about identifying traits with any racial group, if I were a black man, for example, I would be thinking the last thing I want is a social narrative under the heading of equality that sells the notion that black people can't compete with white people, and that it's okay that they can't, and employers have to deal with that somehow. I wouldn't want that being sold as the message if I were a black man. I'd want the message to be, judge us not by the color of our skin, but by the content of our character, quoting the great Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Agreed, and he's going to be canceled here the next year too, because the virtues of which he espoused and which I think are wonderful and helpful are being trampled on now with a lot of this critical race theory talk. And now my whole life we were instructed, don't see color. And I think that is the right way to go through life. And I personally don't. But now our kids are being told you must see color. That's the first thing. And then they're being separated into groups, and it's scary stuff.
Let's make it a big deal
Yeah.
that a person's color of their skin is X, Y, or Z.
Well,
I think that's a bad move.
that's the critical race theory messaging. And, it's about equity, not equality. It's a play on words, and most people
What's the
don't.
difference, Aaron?
Well, equality means everyone has an equal opportunity under the law in society generally. We all have, per our laws, the equal right to achieve whatever we can. Hard work, a lot of motivation that's going to help, and we all have that equal opportunity. But equity is distinguished from equality, and that equity is more of a, we're all supposed to land in the same place at the end, regardless of where we start. So we all,
Or what we do to get there.
correct, and yeah, that doesn't matter. We just need to land in the same spot, and
I call that entitlement.
it is an entitlement. It's a very, I believe, a lot of people would characterize it as a very Marxist idea, but it's something that I'm not aware of being kind of in the zeitgeist anywhere prior, certainly in my lifetime in the culture. But it's being put out there a lot by a lot of the political leaders. There's a lot of certainly the media, and it's being injected into some of our school systems.
Well, the idea, I, as a young person, sort of fell head over heels in love with Ayn Rand. And her philosophy was that socialism and communism are fundamentally evil. It should not be from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. That's a fundamental doctrine of communism. Her attitude was a person who can work hard, overcome obstacles, be persistent, and eventually have the trappings of success, which can include money, that has to be earned no matter who you are. And she didn't talk at all in her books, Atlas Shrugged or The Fountainhead. There's no mention of race in there. There's a mention of parasites versus producers. And the idea is, if you have a producer, get out of his way. and that got into my head, and without any ideas about race of any kind. But now we see, you know, for listeners that listen long after this is recorded, at this moment in time, we have a big upset going on about whether or not Elon Musk gets to be on Saturday Night Live. Yeah, that's an issue. Well, the government has pulled back on Elon in so many different ways. Now, yes, they let him blow rockets up in various places, which you have to blow up a lot of rockets before you can get to Mars, but with people and colonies and equipment, which I think is a good thing to do. I think the human species needs to reach out, but this concept of anyone who gets things done is now got a bullseye on their head.
Yeah, he's evil.
That is disturbing to me.
It is, and that is one of the stories that I've seen in the news feed recently that confused me most when I saw that, multiple cast members at SNL kind of announced that they were uncomfortable with his even presence on the show, and I honestly thought almost everyone loved Elon Musk because of, he's great for the economy. He provides thousands and thousands of jobs. Lord knows how much he pays in taxes. I thought he was viewed almost unanimously as a net positive on society. So when I read that, I was wildly confused. I Mostly it's just because he's rich, and we hate rich guys.
Well,
we hate certain rich guys.
Arguably, he's manipulating markets, which
Yeah.
goes against free trade, especially with cryptocurrencies and things like that. But when a man can personally influence the economy of a nation or the world, that makes him scary and inherently evil, I think, in some people's minds. But here we have now got zero emission vehicles that are fun to drive. We've got electric cars that can run off solar power or wind power. And pretty soon we'll have solar panels on the cars themselves. We've got rockets doing things that NASA could never achieve. And people say, well, that's because they didn't have the technology back then. Well, they have it now, and they can't compete with Elon for delivery of astronauts to the space station. We learned about the Falcon Heavy rockets and the Starship. Those blow up a lot. He's trying to do stuff that was envisioned in Buck Rogers in the 30s. Rockets that could take off and land and not have to scatter their parts all over the planet. Unlike the Chinese Long March booster rocket that now is teetering in orbit, and we're all sort of on the edge of our seat figuring out where that thing's going to come down. But if it hits a city, it's going to be a bad, bad thing because it's a huge rocket. And so obviously, you can't tell the Chinese what to do with their rockets. At least you can try, but they're not going to listen.
They're not listening now. That's
so,
for sure.
But when we take a figure like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk or even Bill Gates, who Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, those early pioneers of home computing, those people changed the world in what I consider generally to be a very positive way. They can take one variable and use that. How many jobs did they create?
Yeah. Agreed. And I get confused as to, why is Bill Gates good and Bezos is good, but Elon's bad? They're sitting in the same strata from a financial perspective. I know there is the market manipulation with the crypto stuff with Elon, and I'm certainly against that. But I don't hear any of these SNL cast members. They're not that knowledgeable about any of that. They just see him as evil. He's a rich, evil man. But why is he bad? But Bill Gates gets to come on and tell us about vaccines nonstop, and we have to listen to him because he founded Microsoft. I'm confused by that.
Yeah, Elon was on Rogan's show not too terribly long ago, and it struck me as a very odd podcast, and I think it struck Rogan as a very odd podcast too. But he was talking about how just a few years ago, that is Elon, was talking about how just a few years ago, he didn't put stock in certain fringe beliefs like UFOs and things like that, and it really sounded. He was very quiet that day, and he was kind of staring at the table as though he were hearing voices and just saying what the voices told him to say. It sort of looked like that, and I'm not saying that's what happened, but it seemed as though his ideas have radically transformed in the last 5 years. And I have the sense that some of that came out of the research into the neural link, which is probably the most cutting edge of the technologies being developed by Elon. is the ability to put neural implants in people. And I see the day, I don't know if we're looking down the barrel of Skynet or the Borg. I did a podcast a while back on the four horsemen of the apocalypse, which is genetic engineering, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, and nanotechnology. When those four technologies combine together, we're going to get results we never ever thought of, and they won't all be good.
Yeah, that scares a lot of people, and I think justifiably so.
But we're figuring out now, we start with something as benign as Google Glass as a machine interface for a human, where if you have something like Google Glass, it could spot the person you're talking to, and their name pops up inside your glasses with a dossier that you could actually be reading while you're talking to the person. Obviously, that would be observable to the other soul, but we've got that. But now we're putting a chip in somebody's brain cavity, which for those of you who are watching, not just listening, would be this thing right here. We start putting machines in there. And I got a computer on my wrist, I got an Apple Watch, but we're going to put something someday soon more powerful than the most powerful supercomputer ever developed inside of this cavity. And it's going to tell the brain what to do. And what's that going to lead to? Especially when these chips are talking to each other in heuristic neural networks of their own in the cyber world. How soon is it that the internet takes over?
Well, you previously asked me what scares me as far as a parent for the development of my children. That most certainly would be in my top five. I like my kids living in the world as we know it now. We spend a lot of time going to national parks. We go hiking all the time. I don't want them dealing with any of that. Like I'd rather them remain as human as they can for as long as they can.
I'm most fearful of the thought police. Those people out there who are telling us what to think. We'll see comments on this podcast today because we've gotten into some edgy, touchy subjects today. And I love the comments, even if they're critical of me, but because I learned from the negative comments more than I learned from the positive comments. But, if we say today, well, we have to be able to spot someone's departure from accepted social norms and on that basis decide their eligibility to own a weapon, which is gun control legislation. How far does it have to go to spotting someone who doesn't conform to desired social norms and order them to undergo a surgery to put a chip in their head so that they get back with the program? And who turns them in? The thought police. He speaks evil, so he's got to be chipped.
Yeah, we're in a version of the Matrix.
Yep. Well, all right. That brings our show to an end today. Thank you so much for being our guest.
Thank you.
It's really fun to have you on. And so tune in next week for another episode of Viewpoint. I'm Brett Godfrey, and thank you for listening.